Last week, Professor John Sheldon spoke to you on our theme of resistance by asking us to rededicate ourselves to the macro societal goal of equal access to the pursuit of happiness for all. In other words, resisting the societal norms that are so common nowadays that not everyone deserves to have enough, that some are not worthy of having enough resources to live with a reasonable standard of living. Well, this week, I'd like to discuss resistance at a much more micro or personal level, spiritual resistance. By that I mean resisting the societal norm to numb our spirits by succumbing to cynicism and fear, and replace it with a focus on spiritual health. I'm going to start today by quoting words that Francesca read to you from the Gathering Words. Reverend Linda Susan Ulrich kind of gave us this paradox of fear and joy, and I'll just grab two parts of it. They said, fear always seems to return. Goodness knows terror finds its way back into the news. We always seem in need of help to roll back big stones that block our way. And this week, I think we had a really big example of it, fear-mongering in the recent election of the Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice. I think we all are sick of hearing it over and over again that it was the most expensive state judicial race in U.S. history, and much of it, frankly, was spent on fear-mongering by both sides. And even after the outcome was undisputed, there was a 10 percentage point difference between the candidates, the opponent continued to drag the race through the mud of cynicism. Then, to top it off, fear immediately followed with the results of the special state Senate race, and there was this growing fear and rumors everywhere that a power grab via impeachment of the very judge who was just elected was probably going to happen. Fear, fear, fear. It was kind of summarized very eloquently by Cornel West in an article in The Guardian about 5 years ago in 2018. Now, Cornel West was talking about racial disparity and racial hatred and contempt, but I think the principles hold true for everybody. He said, "We live in one of the darkest moments in American history, a bleak time of spiritual blackout and imperial meltdown. The undeniable collapse of integrity, honesty, and decency in our public and private life has fueled even more racial hatred and contempt." And then he ends the intro paragraph to the article with this hopeful gesture. "Our last and only hope is prophetic fight back, a moral and spiritual awakening that puts a premium on courageous truth-telling and exemplary action by individuals and communities," unquote. So back to Reverend Ulrich and back to her fear-joy paradox. I'll give you the joy side of it. By the way, Reverend Ulrich is a Unitarian Universalist minister in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So she says, we engage, meaning Unitarian Universalists, we engage in a demanding faith that asks us to love the next world into being today. It's so poetic. We are, and then she puts it in quotes, joyful, though we have considered the facts, unquote. We practice resurrection. I would say we practice resurrection through spiritual resistance. So let me unpack what I mean by spiritual resistance for you today. It's pretty obvious. Today is Easter Sunday for millions of Christians around the globe. Our religious tradition, both on the Unitarian and the Universalist sides, descended from Christianity. And although from the very beginning our interpretation has been a bit different than traditional Christianity. So I'm going to unpack that. It's essentially an Easter story as a human story. So if you were listening when I introduced the Time for All Ages today and what the kids are talking about, it's looking at Jesus as this reformer, as speaking truth to power, and that really caused his death eventually. So let's start from the beginning. Jesus is written in the Gospels as being essentially this perfect human being. And his primary message was love. Remember, the greatest commandment is love? And so everything he did was always answering the call of love in life. He spoke truth to power, not because he was angry. I mean, I'm sure he was, but he spoke it out of love for those who were systemically oppressed. Out of the call to love, he comforted the sick and the outcast. There's numerous stories of performing miracles with people like that. He lived in a beloved community of trusted disciples. And from the stories we've been told, he seemed to be incredibly popular. If you're familiar with the loaves and fishes story, they had to take a small amount of loaves and fishes and divide it among thousands of people that were gathered to hear him talk. Or a week ago, according to the story, Palm Sunday, Jesus came into Jerusalem on a donkey, and the streets were lined with people praising his name and waving palm branches. So definitely a popular figure in a beloved community. This made him the threat to the power structure. And in the end, he was killed for being perceived as too threatening. Well, in all of this is this Easter metaphor. And in Christianity, this is the heyday. This is the pinnacle of the story. This is where most of Christian theology comes from, and everything falls from there. So from our perspective, and this is a classic Unitarian Christian perspective, it is said that Jesus, who was portrayed as a perfect human, was then brutally murdered on the cross and placed in this dark cave tomb, which was sealed with a stone. Now the story says that Jesus descended into hell and then rose again and left the tomb on the third day. It's a beautiful and very powerful metaphor of Jesus. He was the epitome of light, goodness, and love, confronting the dark evilness of the dark side of essentially human nature. The metaphor ends with a message that if we follow Jesus' example, we too can resist the darkness of the world and live a life of light, love, and eternal goodness. Now, of course, we all know that many of the more conservative Christian sects perceive this metaphor to be literal, and they require a belief in a physical death and resurrection to be a true believer. Additionally, most Christians are supposed to lean into a theology of needing Jesus as their only spiritual resistance. There's no other path to spiritual health. Well, of course, these last two tenets of modern Christianity are difficult for most Unitarian Universalists to accept. A literal interpretation of the Easter metaphor requires a leap of faith we generally find difficult because of our preference for reason and metaphorical thinking. Additionally, we recognize that spiritual development is very personal, highly diverse, and includes many relevant paths. So there's an alternative that I'm going to unpack for you today, and we'll see where that goes with religious humanism. For the last 100 years, our theology has moved away from Christian roots towards more of a religious humanist core. In fact, this month, the BATS, which stands for Being a Teen, our teenagers are studying religious humanism as we go through all the major religions of the world or that impact Unitarian Universalism. And I came across a lot of history that I had kind of forgotten, and I want to share some of that with you today. So, the theology of humanism as a religious and a spiritual story. Now, humanism kind of hit a heyday in 1933 with the Humanist Manifesto. Now, the Humanist Manifesto was signed by a bunch of white men, I get that, in Chicago, particularly connected with the University of Chicago, which was a central focus of humanism at the time. And many of these men were Unitarian ministers and a couple of Universalist ministers and free thinkers of the time. And this is what they said in the intro to the Humanist Manifesto. The time has come for widespread recognition of the radical changes in religious beliefs throughout the modern world. The time is past for mere revision of traditional attitudes. Science and economic change have disrupted the old beliefs. Religions the world over are under the necessity of coming to terms with the new conditions created by a vastly increased knowledge and experience. In every field of human activity, the vital movement is now in the direction of a candid and explicit humanism. So essentially, that's the end of the quote. There was a belief that religions, which required faith in the supernatural and relied on something other than humans as an agent of change, would soon fade away. There was a strong feeling back then that eventually religious movements like Unitarian Universalism would dominate in countries like the United States, where religious doctrine is not prescribed by the government and we're free to choose. The early 20th century form of humanism became popular, and many Unitarian and to some degree Universalist congregations embraced it. However, with many religious movements, they too became very, very dogmatic and didn't leave room for diversity of thought or mystery. Nevertheless, and I've said this before from the pulpit, religious humanism continued to have a strong impact on our theology and does so still today. However, religious humanism has shifted and become more approachable, holistic, in my opinion. So it's 90 years later. It's now 2023. I offer you a quote from the Unitarian Universalist Humanist Association from their core values and aspirations. We are naturalists. Although we do not consider humanism to be a religion within the widespread use of the term to denote beliefs and practices resting on some hypothetical supernatural entity, we are religious in that we share with most Unitarian Universalists the natural human desires for, and there's 5 of them, a beloved and accepting community, a purpose greater than ourselves, rituals and practices that resonate with our common humanity and shared mortality, very humbling, and opportunities to work with other tough-minded, warm-hearted people to do good in the world and to help one another attain the greatest possible fulfillment in life. Okay, I want to make sure you got those because there was a lot in there, but they're very, very important to think about. A beloved and accepting community, leading with love. A purpose greater than ourselves. Rituals and practices that resonate with our common humanity and shared mortality. And opportunities to work with other tough-minded, warm-hearted people to do good in the world, speaking truth to power, and to help one another attain the greatest possible fulfillment in life. This sounds utopic. It sounds like heaven on earth. It kind of sounds like what Jesus was teaching to me. In my opinion, this is the kind of community the early Christians were seeking. They wanted to follow the example and teachings of Jesus to bring a new heaven to earth through beloved community. And my friends, these tenets are not just the core values and aspirations of some distant UUA, UU humanists, but they're the core values and aspirations of our 3 fellowships, these congregations. We come together to heal our spirits and resist the cynicism and fear of the world. We need each other for spiritual health. And then we figuratively descend into hell and death that Cornel West described and try to make a difference. This is our resurrection story, living by example in beloved community, and then living through prophetic words and deeds to answer the call of love and help build a better world. So my friends, today I've described briefly very different paths of spiritual health and resisting cynicism and fear, traditional Christianity and religious humanism. To me, they both lead us to somewhat of a resurrection story. So my question to you that I'd like you to talk with each other during coffee, and about 11:30 I'll probably go in the library and see if people want to talk more. The question is, what is your path to spiritual health? And how do you resist the metaphorical dark cave of cynicism and fear? So to close, I'm going to bring you back to those wisdom words of Maria Popova. Don't just resist cynicism, fight it actively. Like all forms of destruction, cynicism is infinitely easier and lazier than construction. There is nothing more difficult, yet more gratifying in our society than living with faith in the human spirit. This faith remains the most potent antidote to cynicism. Especially today, it is an act of courage and resistance. Amen.